There is only one thing a writer can write about: what is in front of his senses at the moment of writing. I am a recording instrument. I do not presume to impose story, plot, continuity. Insofar as I succeed in direct recording of certain areas of psychic process, I may have limited function.
Burroughs came from this very wealthy family in St. Louis. It was his grandfather invented the adding machine, so most of the aunts and uncles were all very wealthy. He had quite a lot of issues with his immediate family. He didn't get on that well with his older brother. His father was rather cold and remote. He adored his mother, and she adored him. And in fact, in later life, she actually once said, "I worship the ground you tread upon," which, of course, is you can tell there's something wrong there. So Burroughs came from this rather curious background. He went to all the most expensive progressive schools, which meant, of course, he never learned how to spell or anything. But he always knew that he was somehow different, shall we say. He was what used to be known as a sensitive child. He had visions, and one day when he was walking with his nanny in the big park in St. Louis, he saw a little green reindeer about the size of a dog, for instance, and which he's convinced he really did see it. And sometimes when he had fevers, he would see little creatures in the walls sort of peeking out at him. Burroughs almost didn't become a writer because his initial attempts at writing were mainly concerned with recording his fantasies and his crush upon one of his friends at Los Alamos School. And he put on paper and a lot of stuff which he later on became acutely sort of embarrassed by, and he was like really terrified that some of the other boys would see it. And by then he was actually not in the school. He'd gone back to visit his parents, and it caused a sort of writer's block which stayed with him for many, many years. And this kind of his knowledge that he was different from most people. I mean, back in those days, this is before the war, long before the war, there was no way of encountering anyone else in the same position. I mean, there was no openness whatsoever about discussing your sexuality. Oddly enough, Burroughs was 22 before he finally found out that babies weren't born through the navel, for instance. I mean, all his friends at Harvard cracked up when he told them this. His knowledge of sexuality was so incredibly naive and innocent. I mean, it's astonishing. So trying to deal with these urges in himself, this sort of nascent sexual preference, I mean, was very, very hard for him. And I think it did cause him to always be a very withdrawn, very defensive person. I mean, throughout his life, he always kept as low a profile as possible. Burroughs was fascinated by the low life, basically. Coming from his privileged St. Louis sort of quasi-aristocratic background, he headed for petty criminals, for junkies, for what he thought of as much more real people. He just hated what he saw as the hypocrisy and obsession with power and money and everything of his family background and the class of people he came from. He thought the guys gambling on street corners were much more real, and this is what he wanted to do, was get down in the mud. And through a friend of his, he went down to a place where Herbert Huncke was living, and Herbert Huncke became one of the key members of the Beat generation, or key influences on the Beat generation. He came up with the word beat, in fact. And Herbert was a gay junkie from a wealthy background, living in the surroundings of Times Square, and known to the local police as the Creep, because he was so unspeakable. I mean, there was nothing that he wouldn't do, no matter how awful it was. And sometimes even the police had to just sling him off Times Square for a bit because they couldn't stand him anymore. So Burroughs befriended him because this is precisely the sort of amazing, weird character that he was intrigued by. And it was through him and a guy called the Sailor, Phil, somebody, and a whole bunch of lowlifes, basically, that he began using junk, because after he'd sold them these morphine syrettes, he kept a few back for himself to experiment with, and then inevitably he needed to buy a few from them, and the price had gone up, of course, and he finished up dealing heroin on the streets. Guns always played a huge part in Burroughs' life. When he was very, very young, he used to go duck hunting with his father and the editor of the St. Louis Dispatch, or whatever the big paper is there. As he put it, it would be a bunch of sort of fat old guys would all get up there and the ducks would take off and they'd all be blasting away. And he actually really enjoyed it. It would be like 6 a.m. and they would be all standing in a swamp or something. And I guess it was a way of relating to his father, who was normally rather remote. And he became kind of obsessed with them. It seems as if they were his way of proving his virility, particularly after he recognized that he was gay. And it always surprised me that he didn't give up his obsession with guns, because of course they were central to the most horrific event in his life, which was of course the killing of Joan, his wife, his common law wife. And in that instance, they had both been drinking a lot. She was an alcoholic. She used to start drinking tequila at about 8 a.m, just sipping it slowly through the day. Burroughs was in an emotionally distraught state. He'd just come back from a trip to South America with one of his erstwhile boyfriends, who he was basically paying to go there, and it was quite obvious that this kid was never going to reciprocate his feelings. And they had only been back in Mexico City for a couple of days, and one day Burroughs was walking down the street and he just felt tears streaming down his face. His face was completely wet, and he knew something was really wrong here, and he was unable to bring it into consciousness, so his natural reaction was to go home and throw down a whole bunch of drinks. And then he went to join his wife at a drinks party above a bar called the Bounty Bar, which was run by American expatriates. And at one point during this drinks party, he said to Joan, "Let's do our William Tell act." And she put a whiskey glass on her head, and he pulled his gun and shot her right there on the hairline, and shot low, in other words. And completely, freaked out. It was madness. As he told me later on, it was insanity anyway. Even if he'd hit the glass, you're in a crowded room. There'd be shards of glass flying everywhere. It was an act of insanity, and this became very central to his life. He thought about Joan every day from then on, and she figured strongly in his dreams. But most of all, he devoted the rest of his life to trying to get rid of that side of himself that caused him to do something so idiotic and so stupid, which he later on used to call the ugly spirit. He had this side of himself he wanted to expunge, and he did it through writing. He tried to identify what was wrong with himself by writing, and tried to identify which controlling systems, which part of his received knowledge had caused this part of him to manifest. Allen Ginsberg met Burroughs when he was, I think, still 17, something like that. He'd only been at Columbia for about 6 months when he ran into Lucien Carr, and through Lucien Carr he met Burroughs. And Burroughs initially was just on the sort of peripheral outskirts of this group of friends, because they were all Columbia people, and Burroughs was living right down in the village and hanging out in gay bars and stuff on Bleecker Street, and had rather a different life. But after Carr killed David Cameron and went off to jail, Ginsberg and Kerouac made a point of going to visit him, as Ginsberg said, to investigate his soul. And Burroughs lived up to this and introduced them to all kinds of books and authors that they'd never heard of. He gave them Spengler and Korzybski. He introduced them to the work of Céline and possibly even Conrad. I think they may not have known of at the time. All kinds of books blew their mind, basically. I mean, at the time, they neither of them admitted the fact that they were gay, and it wasn't until 1953, so jump almost a decade, when Burroughs left Mexico City and came up to New York in order to basically get away from the horrors surrounding the death of Joan, that Burroughs stayed with Ginsberg and they had a pretty intense affair. Burroughs intended originally only to spend about 2 months or something. They finished up spending 6. And in the end, Ginsberg became quite scared, actually, of the intensity of emotion there. That Burroughs kept making up all these routines in which he was going to merge with Ginsberg in some awful way, and sort of schlup, schlup, schlup. And Alan was like terrified. Instead of being amused and thinking this was great, he was absolutely scared to death. And eventually, he told Bill, that he just didn't want to, really have to bring him down heavily. And poor Bill's heart was broken, and he went off to Tangiers and lived in a male brothel for the next 4 years. Burroughs started off writing basically in imitation of Dashiell Hammett and the hard-boiled detective story writers. So his first 2 books were a book called Junkie, which is pretty much straight narrative, and one called Queer, which wasn't published, in fact, till the mid-80s, but was written at that point, directly after Junkie. When he moved beginning of 1954 to Tangiers, he wrote endless series of letters to Ginsberg, always enclosing some kind of amusing routine, just extrapolating from some amusing event that he'd seen, but pushing it to some kind of incredible, surreal length, so that it just took on a life of its own and became, very, very surreal, actually. Well, he called them routines, and they're hothead humour. They have this really distinctive Burroughsian voice, which is a sort of mixture of his Harvard classical education and Fortis sort of junkie street slang, and all sort of mixed up in a very, very unique way, a very, very individual voice. And after a few years of these letters going backwards and forwards, I think it was probably Ginsberg who first identified that this was in fact a book, that Burroughs was creating this incredible body of writing which had to be preserved. So in 1957 he and Kerouac went to Tangiers, and they spent a couple of months typing all these things up and trying to put them into some kind of order. And that eventually, again 2 years later, became The Naked Lunch.
Well, I said, tapping my arm, duty calls. As one judge said to another, be just. If you can't be just, be arbitrary. I cut into the automat, and there's Bill Gaines, huddled in someone else's overcoat, looking like a 1910 banker with paresis. And old Bart, shabby and inconspicuous, dunking pound cake with his dirty fingers shiny over the dirt.
Ultimately, though, the central theme is question everything, basically. Even question language itself, because language embodies within it a whole set of meanings and values that he thinks should be brought into consciousness and questioned. So things which you take for granted and never really look at, patriotism, nationhood, your religion that you grew up in, the value of the family, of your education, question your teachers, question everything. If you then, after you've questioned it, consciously do you agree with it, fine, but at least it's now your opinion and not something that you just took on unconsciously and without thinking. And that was his central message, really, was analyse everything that controls you and see how it stands up. And maybe it won't, maybe it needs changing. And he did very much believe that the only way to change society is to behave badly, basically, to break the rules, sometimes even break the law, because otherwise society is static. He always had the people who found him, who treated him as a mentor, as the learned master, who always looked after all the practical sides of things. Brian Geisen looked after him. Allen Ginsberg, did all the arrangements with publishers and edited him. And none of Burroughs' books were really written directly. They're all very fugitive. You can't really pin them down. There's always some other people there doing the editing or organising it all for him, or shaping the whole book. One book called The Soft Machine, for instance, Burroughs wrote, and it was in a fairly messy form, and then he just took off to Tangiers, and a few days later Ginsberg arrived in Paris and edited the whole thing into shape without Burroughs even being there. And then Brian Geisen designed the cover, Alan wrote the flaps, and again, a collaborative effort. So this is his main side. There's always been a mother figure, or at least a supportive framework. When he came back to the US in 1974 after living abroad for 25 years, he immediately fell into a group of people who looked after him and cooked for him and made an instant friendship circle that he could drop into and just be safe in the centre there and do his creative stuff and do his paintings and have his weird fantasies.